We're going to take a deep dive in how your inner dialogue really holds you back from living the life you want. By not minding what you think, you're really moving your life into a downward spiral. So in this episode, we are going to take you through 3 steps you can do to change your mind. As most people move through life, they don't pay attention to not only the words coming out of their mouth, but the words that are coming out of their mind. And what people don't realize is we may say one thing, but completely be thinking something else. And it's interesting that people don't pay more attention to the thoughts in their head. They're more worried about the words coming out of their mouth. And when we don't pay attention to what's going on between our ears, then we can't understand the roadblocks in our life that's holding us back from really, really going for it. I know I can look at a lot of points in my life when I was in a slump or I was not living at the level I should be. I can go back and look at those times and know that my thoughts were negative and beating me at my own personal journey and weren't allowing me to go as far and hard as I really wanted to go. So as we dive into how to be really mindful and how to really take a hard look at what we're thinking so we can get out of our way and really start going forward on that journey of life. So the first thing I want you to understand is there was a Harvard study done that says 80% of the thoughts that goes through your head are negative. And that stat has always floored me. And the reason is I think I'm a pretty upbeat, positive guy. I don't think I get very negative, even when I'm around people, even when I'm around people that I don't really care for. After hearing that study for the first time, I started really analyzing, the stories and the dialogue I was having with myself. And interestingly enough, I've never been a guy that had those thoughts of, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, any of those type of things. I started realizing I had the thoughts of, doing that's going to suck. Or I had the thoughts of, if I do that, they'll make fun of me. Or I don't want to do that. It feels like work. So it wasn't that I didn't stack up type of things. It was I was already determining the outcome of a situation before it happened. And it was amazing when I came to this discovery years back that I was really more worried about what the outside world thought of me than what I thought of myself. And as I continued on my journey and became more mindful of my thoughts, I realized that I was actively living out those negative thoughts. So I wasn't taking activities. I wasn't doing the things that I should have been doing because those thoughts were winning at the game in that internal dialogue battle that we face on a regular basis. So what I want to do is take you through these 3 particular steps that you can use to be more aware of what's going on inside your mind so you can help rewrite that and actually continue to move forward. So the first one is start understanding the words you're using in your mind. And here's how I did it. Is once I heard that stat that 80% of the thoughts going through your head are negative, I had realized that I had to prove if that was true for myself. So what I did is I would be driving down the road and I'd keep my phone right next to me. And as I was driving, and I do a lot of time, I spend a lot of think time in my truck as I go around, as a thought would pop up, I would immediately go and record that thought on my phone on a recording app. And I didn't care in the moment what it was. I just wanted to capture it. And then I would start playing a game with myself. And what I would do is I would try and come up with something that scared me and figure out how my mind handled that situation. So one of the things I did is, you guys know that I was a sales guy for many, many years. One of the things that I did, and this was really early in my career, is I would say things like, you know what, I'm going to do 100 cold calls today. And then I would shut up and listen to how my mind responded. And interestingly enough, I could catch it. And what would happen is I would think about doing those 100 cold calls, and my mind would instantly go to, oh, that's going to suck. They're going to hang up on you. It's not going to be fun. Why would you even do that? You know, if you start, you're not going to finish, right? And these were all those thoughts that were starting to go through my head, and I started capturing these thoughts down. Here's what happened. As I started recognizing those thoughts, right, as they came through my head, it gave me an opportunity to analyze them, to see if they were truthful, and in some cases actually completely rewrite them. So here's how it happened. I know for a fact one of the thoughts that ran through my head is cold calling sucks. It's no fun. I'm gonna hate it. And I realized that was the thought that was running through my head prior to actively making cold calls. So what I did is I actually set out to prove that what I was telling myself was factual. You know, I'd go out and start a cold call. I'd get hung up on, right? Or somebody would reject whatever I was saying. And I would immediately go, see, I was right. Cold calls suck. It became that self-fulfilling prophecy of constantly saying cold calls suck and then proving they sucked by getting hung up on or getting a no, getting no traction. I was, instead of changing my dialogue, I was proving on a regular basis that my inner dialogue was right. Once I realized that was a thing, I started rewriting it. And I thought to myself, okay, how can I change that dialogue, that story I'm telling myself, so I can actively start moving forward with cold calls? And what I did is I wrote it out. And I wrote out the phrase, cold calls suck. And then I wrote under it, I literally wrote underneath that, and I said, okay, is that true? And underneath that I wrote, not really. The activity itself is no fun, is how I responded, but it brings me in revenue when I do it. And here's the interesting twist. That back half of the sentence is, it brings me in revenue when I do it, started me down the path to rewrite the story. And underneath that I wrote, you know, I don't have to like cold calls, but I do need to bring in revenue. So I went in the next day with the thought process of, I don't like cold calls, but I need the revenue. And it was better. I won't say it was great, but it was better when I started making cold calls. Now, I still ended up getting to that point to where I was still battling my own negativity, because as I made the cold calls, that story came right on through. Right, of cold calls suck, and I stopped making cold calls. I was like, damn it, right, here we go again. So I sat back down with my notepad and said, okay, why did the original story, you know, hold true? Why did I still hate cold calls? And what I realized was I'd spent a good amount of time writing that story, and that it wasn't going to change in just one action. I knew better than to write down something like, I love cold calls, because then I was just flat out lying to myself, and I wasn't going to do that. But I knew I could continue to tweak the story to have a different ending. One of the things I tried next was, I don't like cold calls, but I can get to 20 and see what happens. So I did. So the next day I sat down and said, I can get to 20. Let's see what happens. And the only thing I did really different after I made that realization is I got to the 20. Now, immediately when I got to the 20, I stopped doing the calls, right? I was like, made it. That's as far as I'm going. I'm not doing anymore. So I knew my story wasn't fully there. I knew it had to be stronger. I said, okay, I don't have to like cold calls, but somebody needs me. Somebody needs my service. Somebody needs what I have and do. I'm going to go until I find that person. And here's the interesting thing. As soon as I changed the dialogue to somebody needs me, the mood shifted. My story changed. And I started dialing until I found somebody who needed what I had. It was really, really wild. And I think I went through 30 or 40, maybe even 50 cold calls that day until I found that person. But I found that changing that story and constantly telling myself, I'm going to go until I find somebody who needs what I have, allowed me to get past all that creepiness of the actual cold calling. So I kept pushing forward, and every day I kept telling myself that I'm going to go until I find somebody who needs what I had. And what I didn't realize at the time, it was that phrase that helped me change the entire impact of the story. Because what I was actually telling myself was I didn't care if people didn't need what I had. I was going to find the one who did. So when people were rejecting me on the phone, or when people were pushing back or being uninterested, whatever, I didn't really care because I was going to find the one who did. And that dialogue change was a huge impact in my life. So the first thing I want you to start thinking about is when you hear these thoughts, and now I know I use cold calls as an example, and it doesn't have to be cold calls. You can do this with anything you hate doing, that you know you need to do to move your life or business forward. I mean, it could be journaling, it could be, networking, it could be public speaking, it could be whatever. You can do the same thing by rewriting the story until you figure out what's that story that works for you. It was very impactful for my life, but it was kind of for me only step one in the journey to figure out how to get out of my own way, which takes us right into the second thing you can do to really start changing your mindset. And this one's huge. It's taking action. And this one was really, really tough for me to get used to. And what I find is when we have those thoughts that we don't want to do something or something's going to suck or whatever it is, what I find is we try to find ways to prove that's right? Kind of like I talked about a second ago. We'll do things to ensure that what we're telling ourselves is the right thing, and we'll go out of our way to prove. We'll go back to cold call sucks. If I told myself cold call sucks, I literally would go back to ways to find out how to cold call, make sure cold call sucks. By, just making bad cold calls, or, reading more into somebody's no as taking a personal rejection, whatever. Okay. Once I started rewriting the story, it wasn't totally enough to get me to move over the edge. What I had to do next was to take action. And taking action is more difficult than rewriting the story, because you can tell yourself, I'm going to do an activity and then blow it off, because for some reason it's okay to lie to yourself, because we do it all the time. You get that Sunday night, you're like, oh, I'm going to kick ass on Monday and we're going to crush it. Then Monday gets here, you're like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that so much, right? We lie to ourselves all the time. So taking action can be very, very, very difficult, because I can tell myself all day long to take action, but then it's okay if I don't. Here's what I learned to do to take action. I'm going to use a story with it. The thought behind it is you must set traps for yourself, okay? And here's how I did it. Is I knew at one point while I was doing sales training that my business was growing very well through networking and public speaking. But I was teaching cold calling, although I wasn't cold calling. And I was getting frustrated with myself because I didn't like the idea of teaching something when I wasn't doing it. And I didn't like the idea of standing in front of a room and telling people how to cold call when it was all theory. At that point, I hadn't made cold calls in years because I didn't need to. I knew to be a better trainer and instructor that I needed to pick up the phone and make some dials. But then all those old thoughts from when I was first starting out in sales started creeping back, because if you don't use a muscle, for a while, that muscle becomes weak, and my cold call muscle was wimpy as hell. I decided that I needed to figure out a way that I could get these cold calls done. Well, I remembered when I first got into training, I went up to Baltimore for a training function, And I got to listen in as some of the best trainers in the world were going through and teaching you how to be a sales trainer. On one of these sessions, this guy got in front of the room and he did live dial cold calls. I mean, literally, he stood in front of the room, grabbed a phone, put it on speakerphone, and started prospecting cold calls where we could hear both sides of the conversation. All I could think of is, holy shit, this guy's got brass balls. And I got the recording still to this day, listened to it, and it was funny. Even in the recording, it says, wow, that dude's got brass balls. It was so impactful on me and my life that I've never forgot about that dude standing in front of the room doing cold calls. I remember, that was tremendously helpful when I first started out to keep me doing cold calls. I'm like, look, if that guy can stand in front of the room and do it, I can surely sit by myself and make the calls. What I decided to do is now flash forward and I'm fully in training people and teaching them how to do cold calls. I decided that the next cold call class, I was going to do live dials. So I told my business partner at the time, I'm like, look, I'm going to make live dials in front of the cold call class. And he kind of went stark white, cause, he hadn't done it for his business, but he didn't need to. He was a master at training and everything else. For him, it was a skill set that he was good at. So he didn't need to actually do that portion of it. But I decided that that's what I was going to do. So I picked a date that we were going to take our students and I was going to do live dials in front of the room. Interestingly enough, the day of the event, my business partner had to leave town, so I had to manage all the people and everything, which was fine. But that day, that class ended up being the largest class we had had up to that date. I mean, the room was full. Now, these were seasoned students, new students. I mean, the room was just packed full of people. And it wasn't because they knew that this training was going to be the best training. They wanted to see the monkey in front of the room doing the live dials. So I was okay with it. I knew all these students, and I was okay with it. About a minute before class starts, the door opens to the training room, and in walks the CEO of my largest account. Now, this was a multi-million-dollar account. The CEO had never stepped foot in our training center. Always worked with him on site and brought his people to our training center, and he'd never been there. And as soon as I saw him, my entire insides freaked the hell out. I went, holy shit. And I walked up, we shook hands, and I'm hoping he cannot feel me physically shaking, because now I'm nervous. My largest account is now sitting in the room on a day that for the first time in my life, I'm going to do live cold calls. So I looked at the room and I said, hey, give me 2 seconds, guys. I got to grab a couple things. I'll come right back in and we'll start. What the students don't know is I ran to my office, slammed my door shut, called my business partner up and said, holy shit. And he's like, what happened? What's going on? And I tell him who walked in the room, and his words to me this day were, what? You got this. And, it was the coolest thing because it was exactly what I needed to hear at that point. Got off the phone with him. I walked back in the room. I looked in front of the room and started. And we went through the 2-hour session of doing cold calls. And then it got to the point where you could tell the energy in the room was starting to rise, right? Because I'd gone through everything I could do to teach people how to do cold calls. And it was finally to that point of now I've got to do the actual live dials. I look at the room and they're all looking back at me. And I said, are you ready? And you could just feel the nervousness. I think most people in the room were more scared or nervous for me than I was. I've got my number one account sitting in there with the CEO of the company. And, I quickly went around the room and I asked everybody, why today of all days to show up? And then most of them answered they wanted to watch the live dial so they could figure out some strategy. When I got to that CEO and I asked him the question why he showed up, his response, I've never actually seen you train and I want to see if this shit works. So now here I am getting ready to do live dials and the game's on. Spotlight's on me, and I've got to prove at this moment that our training works. I grab the phone, put it on speaker, and I start doing live dials. Here's the cool thing. My second dial, I set an appointment. And when I hung up the phone, the whole room erupted. As I finished up the day with those guys and went around the room and did kind of a lesson learned portion, I remember asking the CEO, I'm like, after you've sat through all this, did this validate everything you were looking for, or should I look at changing up our contract? And he looked right back at me and said, wow, this shit really works. So I go back to goes through our mind really affects the outcome of what we're doing. Even though I changed the story and said I'm going to do this, it really took me setting a trap and taking action to force me to move forward. By actually, getting me to move forward, I was able to embrace the moment and go for it. So as you're going about your journey, if you want to change the story you're telling yourself, rewrite the story, then take action. Set some sort of trap you can't get out of. Tell a friend about it. Tell, an accountability partner. Tell your wife about it, your husband about it. Tell your kids about it. Tell everybody. One of the greatest traps I ever heard of a guy talk about is he knew he needed to land a deal a week for the next 3 months to be able to get his company back into a safe area financially. So to make sure he closed a deal every month, he went to his little daughter, or a deal every week. He went to his daughter, and I don't recommend this, guys, but he went to his daughter and said, honey, would you like to go to Disney World? And she got all excited, right? I mean, just screaming, running around the house. He goes, okay, I'll make a bet with you. If I close a deal every week, at the end of 3 months, I'll take you to Disney World. And she was just completely in love with this idea. So every day he came home from work, she'd look at him, Daddy, did you close the deal? Not today, honey. And by Friday, he got to the point where, honey, I finally closed one. She got all excited, and she had actually made a little piece of paper that said, Dad made one this week. Well, it was like 3 or 4 weeks in, and it had gotten to like Thursday, and he hadn't closed a deal. And he went home, and she's like, Daddy, did you close a deal today? He goes, no, honey, I just don't know if I'm going to get one this week. And she lost it in total tears, meltdown, freak out. And he was starting to tear up because how heartbroken she was that he hadn't closed the deal. You know what he did the next day? He went and closed 2. I tell you those type of stories is as you change your thoughts, you've got to take action because the action helps reinforce the new story you're telling yourself. So set traps that force you to actively take those actions and keep moving forward. The third thing you can do to really start changing the story is to really start taking inventory of everywhere you are and all the thoughts associated with it. Okay? And here's what I mean is as you go about the day, you're constantly telling yourself a story. And that story is being lived out by the actions we're taking. But we don't often take enough time to sit back and listen to all of those things so that we can figure out what are those specific things holding us back. By taking inventory, here's what I mean. I want you to pick the major areas in your life. So I want you to think about your mind, your health, your family, your work, your spiritual life, all those big 5 key areas. And I want you to write the story down that you tell yourself in each one of those. I'll give you for instance, when I started thinking about my health, one of the stories I realized I was living out was I'm still young enough that I don't have to worry about that shit. And interestingly enough, you're never too young to worry about your damn health, right? We all get one shot. But it was an interesting, as I really started looking at it, that was the story that I was using to hold myself back. I can't say that I'm great on the health aspect, although I do try and be mindful of it. I don't smoke or anything like that, but I don't always have the most healthy eating habits. What I want you to do by taking that inventory is actively start looking at what are those areas in your life that could be more impactful, that could make you more of a badass. And then what are the stories that you're living out because of your inner dialogue that is forcing you to hold you back? So here's how I did it. I actually took a notebook, and at the top of each page, I wrote down those categories. And then under those categories, I really just got to a quiet place, and I started writing down what were my beliefs in those categories. And I found that to be a very difficult exercise for me because I hadn't done it before. So you may find as you start taking your inventory that you struggle with the entire concept of coming up with those key things. What I realized is this wasn't an exercise I could do in one setting. I made myself a challenge that if I would every day just take 5 minutes and work on these stories, that by the time I got to Friday, I could take my wife to dinner, okay? If I didn't, I would have to clean the entire house all by myself while my wife got to sit on her butt and do nothing. And I hate house cleaning, okay? So that was kind of the trap I set for myself. And interestingly enough, I did not have to do the house cleaning that week. I got to take her out to dinner. We just went out Saturday night, that Saturday night. But every day what I realized is I kept looking at the story. I realized that because I hadn't thought about it enough, that I didn't realize how many negative thoughts I really had in my own life in these different areas. So it allowed me to continue to take a deep dive into myself, to be very aware of these areas that were affecting me and how far I could go. It allowed me to start challenging those stories and begin to rewrite them. As you look at the stories you tell yourself, as you go on your journey, and as you're walking through your life, you've got to really start being mindful of what you're telling yourself. Rewrite that story. Take action towards that particular story. Find the traps that force you into action, because action changes everything. And then start taking inventory of everything else, and then take actions on those. Find the traps to continue to move forward. Guys, I promise if you will start rewriting your stories, taking action, figuring out the inventory of what's holding you back, you will start changing how you play the game of life. I really hope this episode helps you out, because if you change your mind, the rest will follow. I love that song. But as you continue to move forward, you've got to continue to change how everything is handled. And here's what I want you to think about is if it's very hard to do a lot of this stuff on your own. It's very hard to get to that level on your own. If you would like to surround yourself with a bunch of badasses that are just going for it, check out the Success Champion group, because it's a group of badasses that are just going for it and are starting to really help each other get up and rise and get up and go and be the person that they always knew they'd be. And it's encouraging the hell out of watch them. Stay tuned for more on this group as it continues to grow. But you can find it on my website at DonnieBoivin.com, and just look for, or on Facebook, just look for Success Champion. Start checking it out. But guys, I hope this episode helped you out. Keep running, keep going, change your mind, and the rest will follow. Run like hell.
What a fun episode today, man. I hope you got a ton out of it. Check out the Success Champion group on Facebook. Let me know what you thought of this episode, and run like hell.